She had been told they would skin her alive, that American soldiers were devils who delighted in torture, who would violate her body and mock her screams. For 47 days, Fumiko had rehearsed her own death in the darkness of that cave, preparing herself for the inevitable moment when the monsters would find her. But when Private James Connor sat down across from her in the dirt of that makeshift prisoner camp and held out a hamburger with a tired smile, whispering, "Just try it," everything she had been taught began to crumble. Darkness had become normal, not the darkness of a room at night where shapes emerged as eyes adjusted, but the absolute blackness of being buried alive. Fumiko had stopped counting days around the third week. Time meant nothing when every moment was identical to the last. The same hollow ache in her stomach, the same dampness seeping through her nurse's uniform, now more whole than fabric, the same whimpering of the child who would not live much longer. The cave had seemed like salvation when they first crawled inside. The American artillery had turned the world above into chaos, the ground itself screaming as shells tore through earth and flesh without distinction. Fumiko and 37 others, mostly civilians with a handful of wounded soldiers too broken to fight, had found the opening during a brief pause in the bombardment. They squeezed through rocks still warm from nearby explosions, descending into the earth like souls fleeing judgment. That was in April. Now it was June, though Fumiko only knew this because one of the soldiers, before he died, had scratched marks on the cave wall. 47 lines. 47 days of surviving on almost nothing. The word hunger was inadequate. Hunger was what you felt before dinner, a polite growling of the stomach. This was systematic disintegration, her body consuming itself, fat reserves exhausted weeks ago, now feeding on muscle. Her gums bled constantly. Her hair came out in clumps. The bones of her hips pressed against skin so tightly that sitting on stone was agony. Every movement required negotiation with a body that wanted only to stop. They had eaten everything. The emergency rations lasted 4 days. Then they scraped moss from the cave walls, bitter and slimy, offering almost no nutrition, but giving the mouth something to do. They caught water dripping from stalactites, holding out tin cups for hours to collect a few precious ounces. Someone found roots pushing through cracks in the limestone. The roots tasted of earth and rot, but they chewed them anyway, careful not to swallow too fast because their shrunken stomachs would rebel. On day 32, Michiko, a girl of 15 who had been mobilized as a volunteer nurse like Fumiko, caught a slug. She held it up in the dim light of their single dying candle, this gray writhing thing, and looked around at the hollow faces surrounding her. No one spoke. She put it in her mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed. After that, they hunted for slugs in the dampest corners of the cave. There were never enough. The propaganda had prepared them for suffering, but not like this. Fumiko had been raised in Naha, the daughter of a schoolteacher who believed in the empire with religious fervor. She remembered sitting in the school assembly hall at 17, listening to an officer explain what would happen when the Americans came. He had spoken with absolute certainty. The Americans were not human, he said. They were beasts wearing human skin. They raped every woman they found, often until death. They tortured prisoners for entertainment. They cut off fingers and ears as trophies. Death was preferable. Death was honorable. Fumiko had believed him. Everyone believed him. To doubt was to betray the emperor, and betraying the emperor was worse than dying. She had been trained as a nurse specifically to tend wounded soldiers, but also to prepare herself for the end. They gave each nurse a small blade. They showed them where to cut. Quick, they said. Across the throat or into the stomach. If the Americans come, you know what to do. She had touched that blade every day in the cave, feeling its edge, planning. But the child changed everything. His name was Kenji, and he was 6 years old. His mother had died on day 12, quietly, whispering apologies that grew fainter until they stopped. Kenji had stopped crying after that. He just sat in the corner, eyes open but not seeing, growing smaller each day. By day 40, he could not walk. His breathing sounded wrong, wet and shallow. On day 47, the silence came. After months of constant artillery, aircraft, the distant sound of battle, everything stopped. The Americans had won. Everyone in the cave knew it without speaking. The silence was heavier than the explosions had been. "We should go out now," someone whispered in the darkness. "End it properly. Not down here like animals." Others agreed. Death before dishonor, death before capture. That was the code. Several people began moving toward the entrance, preparing themselves. Fumiko picked up her blade. Then Kenji made a sound. Not a word, just a small whimper. She looked at him, this tiny bundle of bones and skin, and something broke inside her. He was 6 years old. He did not understand honor or empire or duty. He understood only that he hurt, that he was afraid, that he wanted his mother. I am taking him out, Fumiko heard herself say. I am surrendering. The cave erupted in hisses and angry whispers. Traitor, coward, disgrace. She did not argue. She wrapped Kenji in the remains of her jacket, lifted him, he weighed almost nothing, and began crawling toward the entrance. A few others followed. Most stayed behind. Fumiko never learned what happened to them. The sunlight was violence. After 47 days underground, the brightness felt like acid poured directly into her eyes. Fumiko stumbled forward blindly, one arm across her face, the other clutching Kenji. She emerged onto a hillside that had been green once. Now it was gray and brown, cratered, stripped of vegetation, littered with debris both mechanical and human. The smell hit her next, sweet rot and chemical burn and cordite, a combination that made her retch even though her empty stomach had nothing to give. She stood there swaying, waiting for bullets, waiting for the monsters to appear. Instead, she heard a voice shouting in English. Footsteps running. She squeezed her eyes shut, held Kenji tighter, and waited for pain. What came was a hand on her shoulder, gentle, and a canteen pressed to her lips. She gasped, choking on water that her throat had forgotten how to swallow properly. Someone took Kenji from her arms. She tried to fight but had no strength, and through the spots dancing across her vision, she saw an American soldier cradling the boy, calling urgently for a medic. This was not how it was supposed to happen. There were supposed to be monsters. More hands guided her down the hillside. She walked because the alternative was being carried, and some stubborn part of her refused that indignity. Other survivors from the cave stumbled alongside her, a parade of skeletal figures caked in filth, blinking in the devastating sunlight. American soldiers flanked them, weapons lowered, faces carefully neutral. Some looked disturbed. One young soldier turned away and vomited into the dirt. They were loaded onto trucks with surprising gentleness. Fumiko sat on the metal floor, surrounded by people who had been her companions in darkness, all of them too exhausted and confused for speech. The truck rumbled down a makeshift road, past burned-out tanks and collapsed buildings and palm trees shattered into splinters. Okinawa had become a corpse. The camp appeared after an hour. Rows of tents surrounded by wire fencing, guards at gates, organized chaos that seemed impossible after the primal disorder of the cave. They were processed with bureaucratic efficiency that felt surreal. American soldiers whose uniforms were clean, whose faces were fed, gestured and pointed and spoke in their harsh, incomprehensible language. A few Japanese translators moved among the prisoners, themselves looking uncomfortable, explaining in soft voices that they would be fed, that they would receive medical attention, that they were not going to be harmed. Fumiko did not believe them. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. They separated women from men. They gave her a thin blanket. They led her group to a tent where rows of cots waited. She chose one in the corner, sat on its edge, and tried to understand what was happening. Other women filed in, all wearing the same expression of stunned disbelief. Some cried quietly. Others sat in silence, still as statues. Then the smell reached her. It drifted through the tent flap, carried on the afternoon breeze, and Fumiko's entire body responded before her mind could catch up. Her mouth flooded with saliva. Her stomach cramped violently. The smell was meat cooking, fat sizzling, bread warming, rich, heavy, overwhelming, completely unlike anything in her experience of food. Japanese cuisine was built on subtlety, delicate broths, precisely seasoned rice, fish prepared to highlight natural flavor. Even before the war, before the privation, meals were elegant exercises in restraint. What drifted into that tent was the opposite of restraint. It was abundance made aromatic. It was excess incarnate. An American soldier appeared in the tent entrance, young and sunburned, carrying a tray stacked with food. He moved down the row of cots, handing out portions, saying something in English that was probably meant to be reassuring. The women closest to the door accepted their portions with trembling hands, staring at the food as if it might disappear. When he reached Fumiko, she looked down at what he offered. Bread, white and soft, beans in sauce, something that might have been meat, and vegetables pale and cooked, arranged without artistry. It was more food than she had seen in months. It was also completely alien. She shook her head, pulling back. The soldier frowned, concerned, and said something else. He gestured at the food, at her, made eating motions with his free hand. She shook her head again, more firmly. Her body screamed for her to take it. Her mind knew better. Poisoned. It had to be poisoned. Why else would the enemy feed prisoners? The soldier looked frustrated. He called over one of the translators, an older Japanese man who approached with careful steps and spoke to Fumiko in a gentle voice. "Please eat. It is safe. You must eat." "I will not," Fumiko whispered. Speaking hurt her throat. "I know what this is." "It is food," the translator said. "Only food. It is poison. You are trying to make it easier, to make us trust before—" She could not finish the sentence. The translator's face sagged with sadness. He said something to the American soldier, who shook his head and moved on, leaving the tray of food on the cot next to Fumiko. The smell was torture. Her body betrayed her, growling and cramping, demanding she eat. She pressed her hands to her stomach and refused. Around her, other women slowly began to eat, some cautiously tiny bites, waiting for death. When death did not come, the bites grew larger. Soon the tent filled with the sounds of desperate eating, the kind without manners, without pause, eating that was pure survival. Fumiko watched them. She told herself they were fools. She told herself she would rather starve than give the Americans the satisfaction. But mostly she was terrified. Terrified that if she ate, something would break inside her. That accepting food from the enemy meant accepting that everything she had been taught was a lie. That her suffering had been for nothing. That the 47 days in darkness, the hunger, the fear, the death of companions, all of it had been based on stories that were not true. Private James Connor had been in the Pacific for 11 months, and he was so tired that exhaustion had become his natural state. He no longer remembered what it felt like to sleep without jerking awake at every sound. He no longer remembered Kansas, because that was where home was, not Nebraska, as he sometimes told people. A farm outside Wichita where wheat grew in endless golden rows, and the sky was so big you could see weather coming from tomorrow. That world felt fictional now. This was real, the mud, the blood, the impossible heat, the way bodies swelled in the sun if you did not bury them fast enough. Okinawa had been the worst of it. 11 weeks of fighting for an island that was supposed to take 3. The Japanese had not fought like an army retreating. They fought like cornered animals, vicious and desperate, making the Americans pay for every yard with blood. Connor had killed people. He did not know how many. You did not count. Counting made it too real. In the moment, they were targets. Afterward, they were things you did not think about unless you wanted to stop functioning. When Okinawa finally fell, Connor expected relief. Instead, he got processing duty. The brass needed soldiers to manage the thousands of Japanese prisoners and displaced civilians flooding into camps. Connor supposed he should be grateful. It was better than walking point through suspected minefields. But there was something uniquely awful about this work. The prisoners were not what he expected. The propaganda had primed him for fanatical warriors who would fight to the last man. Instead, he found skeletons dressed in rags, women who flinched at every movement, children who had forgotten how to be children, old men who had clearly been farmers, not soldiers, conscripted into a losing war and now abandoned by their own military. The worst were the ones fresh from hiding. They emerged from caves like creatures from another world, blinking and terrified, their bodies so wasted that Connor could see the shape of every bone. Some had been underground for weeks. They stank of filth and sickness. Their eyes held a particular kind of trauma that Connor recognized. He saw it in mirrors when he was careless enough to look. His current assignment was food distribution. 3 times daily, he and a handful of other soldiers delivered rations to the civilian tents. It should have been simple work. It was not. Many prisoners refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others ate too fast and made themselves sick. Some would not eat unless a translator, or, more effectively, an American soldier ate first to prove safety. Connor had taken to carrying a sandwich with him on rounds. He would take a bite, exaggerated and obvious, before handing out rations. It helped. A little. On his third day of distribution duty, Connor noticed her. A woman sitting alone in the corner of one of the tents, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat, staring at nothing. There was untouched food on the cot beside her. The same food he had tried to give her yesterday, and the day before. She was starving, that was obvious. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked and bleeding. But when he approached with a fresh tray, she pulled back as if he had offered her a snake. Connor tried the usual routine, smiled, gestured, took a bite of bread himself. She watched him with an expression that was not hunger or gratitude, but pure animal terror. She thought he was going to hurt her. The realization hit Connor like a punch. After 3 days of Americans feeding her, giving her water, providing medical care, she still thought torture was coming. What the hell had they told these people? Connor set the tray down and retreated. He mentioned it to Sergeant Morrison, who shrugged. Some of them won't eat no matter what. Can't force them. They'll come around or they won't. But Connor could not stop thinking about her. That night, lying in his tent listening to other soldiers snore, he kept seeing her face, the terror in it, the absolute conviction that he was a monster. He had shot people. He had watched friends die in ways that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. He had done things in this war that he would never speak about. Not to his parents, not to a wife if he ever had one, not to anyone. But he had never tortured anyone. He had never hurt someone who was not actively trying to kill him. The idea that this woman looked at him and saw a devil made something twist in his chest. The next morning, Connor went to the field kitchen before his distribution rounds. The cooks were heating up the usual, beans, bread, some kind of meat stew. But in the corner, Connor spotted something different. A small grill where one of the cooks was making himself breakfast. Hamburgers. Real hamburgers, or as real as army cooks could make with whatever mystery meat they had available. "Hey, Collins," Connor called to the cook. "Can I get one of those?" Collins looked surprised. "The burgers? I was making these for us, not for the prisoners." "It is for a prisoner," Connor said. "But I need it to look good, not like rations, like actual food." Collins studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, kid. You want the works?" 10 minutes later, Connor had a hamburger that looked almost civilized. Grilled patty, actual bun, even a slice of something that might have been cheese. It was warm. It smelled good. It was the kind of thing you would serve at a church picnic back home. Not fancy, but honest. Connor carried it carefully through the camp, past rows of tents and busy soldiers and exhausted prisoners who no longer had the energy to look curious. He reached the women's tent and ducked inside. She was in the same place, the same position, still not eating. Connor walked over and sat down on the dirt floor directly in front of her cot. This broke several protocols. You were supposed to maintain distance, maintain authority. But Connor did not care. He set the hamburger on a tin plate between them. She stared at it, then at him. Her expression was unreadable. Connor picked up the hamburger and made a show of examining it. He took a large bite, chewed slowly, swallowed, made an exaggerated expression of satisfaction. "See?" he said, knowing she could not understand the words. Not poison, just food. He held the hamburger out to her. "Just try it." The woman, he did not know her name, would never know her name, stared at the hamburger like it was a theological problem. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Connor, at the food, at the other women in the tent who had stopped their own activities to watch. Slowly, incrementally, her hand reached out. Fumiko had spent 3 days preparing to die. When death did not come, she spent another 2 days waiting for torture. When torture did not come, she decided that the Americans were simply waiting, that the cruelty would arrive when she lowered her guard. So she would not lower her guard. She would not eat their food. She would not trust their gentleness. She would maintain her dignity and her suspicion until the inevitable end. But the soldier who sat in front of her now did not look like a devil. He looked young, tired, sunburned and rumpled and somehow earnest in a way that made no sense for an enemy combatant. And the thing he held out to her smelled like nothing she had ever experienced. It was not the delicate aroma of miso or the clean scent of fresh rice. It was heavy, rich, almost aggressive. Meat that had been cooked with fire until the fat crisped. Bread that was soft rather than sticky. Something else she could not identify, layered and complex. Her body made the decision before her mind could interfere. Her hand moved. She watched it extend as if it belonged to someone else, reaching across the space between enemy and prisoner, between belief and reality. Her fingers touched the warm bun. The soldier smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a victorious smile, just tired and encouraging, the way her father used to smile when she was learning something difficult. Fumiko lifted the hamburger. It was heavier than expected. She brought it to her lips, hesitated one final moment, and bit down. The texture was wrong. Japanese food was rice, soft and precise. Fish, delicate. Vegetables, crisp or pickled. This was something else entirely, dense, yielding meat that required chewing. The bun compressed and released. Something wet and savory hit her tongue. Then the taste arrived. It was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was fat and salt and char and a complexity of flavor that overwhelmed her palate completely. Umami, but not the gentle umami of dashi. This was aggressive, primal, the taste of abundance and excess. The meat had been seasoned with something strong. The bun was faintly sweet. There were other layers she could not parse because her brain was too busy reacting to the simple fact that she was tasting food. Real food, rich food, after months of near starvation. Her stomach cramped immediately. After weeks of near nothing, the sudden influx of fat and protein was a shock. Saliva flooded her mouth more than she needed, her body overreacting. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to vomit, but she did not stop eating. She took another bite, and another. It was too much, it was overwhelming, it was impossible, but she could not stop. Somewhere around the fourth bite, Fumiko began to cry. It started as a small thing, a tightness in her throat, a burning in her eyes. Then it grew. Tears spilled down her cheeks, dropping onto the hamburger, mixing with the grease on her fingers. Her shoulders shook. A sound escaped her that was part sob, part gasp. She kept eating. The soldier said something in English, his voice alarmed. She could not look at him, could not stop crying, could not stop eating. These three things were happening simultaneously, and she had no control over any of them. Other soldiers appeared. She was vaguely aware of voices, movement, concern. Someone tried to take the hamburger away. She clutched it tighter, made a noise that was almost animal. They backed off. The crying became worse. Full sobs now, the kind that hurt the chest and steal breath. Her body was doing things without permission, weeping and eating and shaking all at once, every system overloaded. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was the collapse of everything. For 47 days, Fumiko had survived by believing in a story. The Americans were devils. Surrender was disgrace. The emperor was divine. Suffering had meaning. Death was preferable to capture. Every part of that story was disintegrating in her mouth. Because if the Americans were devils, why was this one sitting in the dirt with her? Concern written across his young face. If they delighted in torture, why had 3 days passed with nothing but gentleness? If they were the barbaric enemy, why did their food taste like this? Like they had so much abundance that they could afford to make something rich and complex and give it freely to a prisoner? The hamburger was not just food. It was evidence. Evidence that while she and her people had been starving, had been eating moss and slugs and dying slowly in caves, the other side had been eating like this, casually, normally. This hamburger was not special to them. It was ordinary, standard, the kind of thing you made at the field kitchen for a regular meal. The abundance was crushing. The disparity was crushing. The realization that her suffering had been, what? Unnecessary, based on lies, part of a war that her side was losing because they simply did not have the resources to compete with a nation that could feed its soldiers hamburgers in the field. Fumiko finished eating. The hamburger was gone and her hands were greasy and her face was wet with tears, and she felt simultaneously full and hollow. The young soldier was still there. He handed her a canteen, not forcefully, just offered it. She took it, drank, the water cutting through the grease in her mouth. She tried to speak, to say thank you, but what came out was another sob. He seemed to understand anyway. He nodded slowly, said something soft in English, and stood up. Before leaving, he set another portion of food on her cot, regular rations. Then he walked away, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her certainty. Other women in the tent were staring. Some looked confused. Others looked like they understood completely. One older woman leaned over and whispered, "They are not what we were told." Fumiko shook her head, not in disagreement, in disbelief, in grief. "No," she whispered back, "they are not." That night, Fumiko ate the rations. She forced herself to eat slowly, to let her shrunken stomach adjust. The food was bland compared to the hamburger, but it was still more than she had eaten in months. Around her, other women did the same. The tent filled with the quiet sounds of eating, of survival, of people choosing to live even when living meant accepting that they had been lied to. Fumiko lay on her cot afterward, staring at the canvas ceiling. Her body ached. Her mind ached worse. She thought about the soldier who had shared his food with her. She thought about his face. Young, tired, human, not a demon, just a boy far from home, stuck in a war he probably did not want, trying to do something kind in the middle of horror. She thought about Kenji. The medics had taken him immediately upon arrival. She had not seen him since. She did not know if he was alive. She prayed to ancestors she was no longer sure were listening that he was. She thought about the women who had stayed in the cave, who had chosen death over dishonor. Were they braver than her, or had she been braver by choosing life? The question had no answer. Both choices were impossible. Most of all, she thought about the hamburger, the way it tasted, the way it represented everything she had not known about the world. Somewhere across an ocean, there was a place where food like that was common, where soldiers in the field ate better than Japanese civilians in peacetime, where the industrial capacity was so vast that they could send thousands of tons of supplies across the Pacific to feed an invading army hamburgers. How do you fight a country like that? How had her leaders thought they could win? The propaganda had an answer for that too, she remembered. Spirit. Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. Purity of purpose would defeat industrial might. The divine wind would protect the homeland. But there was no divine wind. There was just war, brutal and mechanical. And now there was defeat, complete and undeniable. Fumiko closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, she dreamed of darkness and hunger, and a taste she could not forget. In the days that followed, the camp settled into a routine. Prisoners were processed, documented, assigned to work details if they were healthy enough. Medical teams moved through constantly, treating infections, malnutrition, injuries that had gone untended for months. The mortality rate was high. Too many people had been starving too long, their bodies too damaged to recover even with food and medicine. Fumiko survived. Her body, younger and stronger than many, began to recover. The bleeding in her gums stopped. Her hair stopped falling out. She gained weight slowly, her frame filling in incrementally. Physically, she was healing. Mentally was different. She was assigned to help in the medical tent, her training as a nurse making her useful. She worked alongside American medics, learning to understand their gestures if not their words. She saw their efficiency, their disregard for rank when treating patients, the way they expended resources on Japanese prisoners that her own military would never have spent on their own soldiers. One day, she was helping treat a child with dysentery when she overheard two American soldiers talking. One of them gestured at the medical supplies stacked in crates. "We use more keeping these prisoners alive than we spent on ammo taking the island," he said, sounding amazed. The other soldier shrugged. "That's the difference between us and them, I guess." Fumiko pretended not to have heard, but the words echoed. That is the difference. Resources, priorities. A system that valued efficiency and logistics over ritual suicide and glory in death. She saw Private Connor occasionally. He was still on distribution duty. They did not speak. She knew no English. He knew no Japanese. But there was a recognition between them. A nod. A small acknowledgement. Once he brought her an orange. Not special treatment, just an extra from a shipment. She ate it slowly, savoring the burst of sweetness, the vitamin C her body desperately needed. Other prisoners began to thaw as well. Conversations started. Small ones at first, whispered in corners but growing bolder. What now? What happens to us? Will they send us home? Is there a home to return to? Rumors circulated. Tokyo had been bombed into rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by some new kind of weapon. The emperor was going to speak on the radio. The war was over. The war would never be over. Japan would rise again. Japan was finished. No one knew what to believe. But slowly, the paralyzing terror faded. The Americans were not going to torture them. That much was clear. What they were going to do remained uncertain, but immediate death was no longer the expectation. Fumiko found herself thinking often about the hamburger. It had become symbolic in her mind, representing the moment when her understanding of reality shifted. She told the story once, to another nurse, trying to explain the experience. The woman listened and nodded. "I cried over soup," she said quietly. "They gave me soup and I could not stop crying. Because it was hot and it was free and they did not have to give it to me." Everyone had a moment like that. A moment when the cognitive dissonance became too much and something broke. Food was often the trigger. After months or years of privation, of being told that sacrifice was noble and suffering was necessary, the casual abundance of the American military was devastating. They had lost to a country that could afford to waste food. Connor did not talk much about what happened. When his buddies asked why he spent so much time with the prisoners, he shrugged. Someone has to. When they joked about him going soft, he did not argue. Let them think what they wanted. But he kept the assignment. He requested to stay on distribution duty even when rotation back to regular guard shifts was offered, because he had seen something in that woman's face when she finally ate. He had seen a person choosing to live when death would have been easier. That took a kind of courage he respected. He started learning Japanese words, basic ones. Thank you, water, medicine. The prisoners appreciated it. Small gestures mattered in a place where everything else was stripped away. One evening, Connor was distributing dinner rations when he saw Fumiko working in the medical tent. She was helping a medic wrap bandages, her movements efficient and professional. She looked different than she had 2 weeks ago. Less skeletal, less terrified. Still thin, still marked by what she had endured, but alive in a way she had not been. Their eyes met across the camp. She bowed slightly. The formal Japanese bow that Connor had learned meant respect. He nodded back, awkward but sincere. He would never know her name. She would never know his. They would never speak beyond gestures and nods. In a few months, Connor would ship home to Kansas, where he would try and fail to explain what the war had been like. He would marry a girl from his hometown, have 3 children, work the farm his father left him, and live a quiet life. He would wake sometimes from nightmares of Okinawa, but he would never speak of them. The hamburger moment would fade into the general fog of war memories, significant but not unique. Fumiko would remain in the camp for 8 months until repatriation was organized. She would return to Okinawa to find that her family home had been destroyed, her father killed in the bombardment, her mother and sister relocated to the mainland. She would eventually find them. She would rebuild a life in the ruins of the old one. She would never speak of the 47 days in the cave, not to her future husband, not to her children, but sometimes, eating a meal, she would remember the taste of that hamburger, the way it had broken her open, the way it had forced her to see the truth. Both of them would carry that moment forward, a small point of connection in a war that specialized in disconnection. Neither would know how much it mattered to the other. Neither would know that decades later, in their separate corners of the world, they would both sometimes think about that afternoon in a prison camp when an act of simple kindness became something larger. The Battle of Okinawa killed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and approximately 150,000 Okinawan civilians. American casualties exceeded 60,000. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, a preview of what invasion of the Japanese mainland would cost. The numbers are staggering and sterile. They do not capture what starvation feels like, what propaganda does to a mind, what it means to emerge from darkness expecting death and receiving a hamburger instead. Food has always been a weapon of war. Starvation as siege tactic, supply lines as strategic targets, rationing as civilian burden. But food is also diplomacy. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe partly through food aid. Military rations distributed to civilians became proof that the conqueror was not the monster propaganda had promised. For prisoners like Fumiko, that first meal from American supplies was cognitive warfare of a different kind. It exposed the material disparity that made the war's outcome inevitable. It revealed the lie of propaganda, and it offered a choice: keep believing the story and starve on principle, or accept reality and live. Most chose to live. That choice came with shame, with grief, with a reconfiguration of identity that would take years to process. But it also came with survival. The hamburger that Connor gave Fumiko was not special by American standards. It was field rations, barely a step above emergency supplies. But to someone who had eaten slugs and moss for weeks, it was impossible luxury. That gap, between what was ordinary for one side and impossible for the other, defined the war's outcome more than tactics or courage or any individual battle. Japan lost because it was fighting an industrial power with an agricultural economy, because its military priorities emphasized spirit over logistics, because nationalism and propaganda convinced millions to endure suffering that policy decisions had made inevitable. The atomic bombs ended the war, but the writing was on the wall long before August 1945. It was written in the supply chains, the factory output, the ability to feed an army across an ocean while the enemy's civilians starved at home. For the individual participants, these grand strategic truths were irrelevant. They lived in the immediate, the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, the small mercies that punctuated horror. A hamburger, a canteen of water, a smile from an enemy who was supposed to be inhuman. Fumiko's breakdown was not unique. Across the Pacific, in camps and hospitals and surrender ceremonies, thousands of Japanese prisoners and civilians experienced similar moments of disorientation. The enemy was not what they had been told. The war had been lost for reasons they did not fully understand. The sacrifices they had made, the starvation, the fear, the death of loved ones, had been in service of something that was always doomed. Processing that realization required more than food. It required rebuilding an entire worldview. For some, it was impossible. They clung to the old stories, to the belief that surrender was disgrace and that death would have been preferable. For others, like Fumiko, survival became its own form of resistance, living in spite of what they had been taught, building something new from the ruins of the old beliefs. The hamburger was a catalyst. It was not salvation. Nothing could save what had already been lost. But it was a beginning, the first bite of a new reality, the taste of a world that had been kept hidden by propaganda and isolation. Connor never knew any of this. He gave away a hamburger because a woman was starving, and he had the means to help. Simple human decency in a context that made such gestures rare. He never knew about the 47 days in the cave. Never knew about the propaganda that had convinced her he was a demon. Never knew that his small act of kindness helped break the spell of years of indoctrination. That is perhaps the most powerful part of the story. Neither participant knew the full significance of their moment. They were just two people, enemies by designation, human by nature, connecting across a chasm of language and culture and war through the most basic of human needs, food and compassion. In the end, that is what survives. Not the grand strategies, not the political ideologies, not the rhetoric that justifies sending young people to kill each other. What survives are the small moments of humanity that persist despite everything. A soldier who shares his lunch, a woman who chooses to live, the understanding that the person across from you is not a devil, but just another person, hungry and scared and far from home. Okinawa is rebuilt now. The caves where people hid and died have become memorials. The battlefields are parks. The island has been absorbed into the long, complex peace that followed the war. But the memory remains, in the stories passed down, in the monuments erected, in the collective understanding that this place witnessed something terrible, and that those who lived through it carried scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Fumiko's story is one among millions. Her 47 days in darkness, her emergence into light, her breakdown over a hamburger, these are not unique experiences but representative ones. Multiply her story by hundreds of thousands, and you begin to approach the civilian cost of the Pacific War. Add the soldiers, Japanese and American and all the others who fought and died across those islands, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. So we focus on the individual, the moment, the hamburger, because that is a scale humans can understand. That is where empathy lives. In the specific detail of one person's suffering and one person's kindness, and the unexpected collision of the two in a prison camp on an island neither wanted to be on. The war ended, the camps closed, The prisoners went home or tried to. The soldiers returned to farms in Kansas and cities along the coasts and small towns in between. They took their memories with them, carried them forward into peace, let them shape the rest of their lives in ways both obvious and subtle. And sometimes, decades later, an old woman in Okinawa would taste something rich and fatty and American, and she would remember. She would remember darkness and hunger and terror and the taste of truth. She would remember a young soldier who offered kindness when cruelty was expected. She would remember choosing to live. That choice echoes. It echoes in her children and grandchildren. It echoes in the rebuilt island and the peace that followed. It echoes in every small act of humanity that punctures the machinery of war. One hamburger, one moment, one choice to try, despite everything, to live. That is where history lives, not in the grand sweep of campaigns and conferences, but in the moment when a starving woman takes food from an enemy's hand and realizes that everything she believed was wrong. That revelation breaks her, but it also eventually frees her. The story ends there, not with resolution because war does not offer resolution, not with healing because some wounds never fully close, but with continuation, with survival, with the stubborn, persistent fact that even after everything, the starvation, the terror, the loss, people keep going. They rebuild, they remember, they pass the stories down, and sometimes those stories are about hamburgers and kindness and the moment when the enemy became human. Those stories matter. They matter because they remind us what is lost in war and what, despite everything, remains. They matter because they are true, and truth, even painful truth, is worth preserving. So the story is told, in different versions, in different voices across decades and languages, but always with the same core. In the ruins of Okinawa, in the chaos of defeat, a soldier and a prisoner found a moment of grace. It did not erase the war. It did not undo the suffering, but it existed. And that existence, that small point of light in overwhelming darkness, is what we carry forward. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the human cost of war and the power of small acts of kindness, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you untold stories from history, the moments that textbooks overlook, but that reveal the true nature of humanity in our darkest hours. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Your support helps us continue researching and bringing these forgotten voices back to life.